All right. I want to welcome everybody. I'm very happy that we are resuming this particular class series, which LaRouche Pax started a couple of months ago, entitled Rediscovering the Soul of America. In the interim, we've had some very important conferences addressing the economic crisis, a very happy celebration of the occasion of the 100th anniversary of Lyndon LaRouche's birth. But we are back to this particular topic, which in the wake of the recent orgy of attention on the death of Queen Elizabeth is especially important because we truly do need to rediscover the soul of America. I was talking with a friend, a farmer out in Minnesota. I think it was on the day of Queen Elizabeth's funeral. And he was kind of agog, saying, I just don't understand what's wrong with people. And he was talking about the adulation pouring out from the media, the shocking adulation coming from many so-called conservative icons. And he just said, how could this happen? And I said, it happened because they have obscured for really more than 100 years the actual philosophical and economic principles which created this great republic of ours. There has been a concerted effort, really, I'm sure, since the ink dried on both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, to attack, or more recently, since they realized after maybe the first 100 years of attacks, it wasn't going to work, the spirit of the American Revolution, of the creation of this republic, had just been too strong and fought back too often. So that the strategy, frankly, of the last 100 and so years has been to completely eliminate the actual philosophical foundations of the American Revolution and of the creation of our Constitution. And similarly, a complete wiping out of the knowledge of the American system of political economy. That's one of the reasons why so many of our fellow Americans can be so foolish sometimes on economics. They can see what's wrong. You have to be brain dead today not to see what's wrong with what the Biden administration is doing with the destructive green policies, the endless money printing. Now the Federal Reserve is going to be trying to turn on the tourniquet, none of which is going to work. People can see that these policies don't work, but then they'll flip to the other side and end up thinking that we have to go into some budget cutting orgy or free trade orgy in order to undo the damage that's been done. What's been taken out of the discussion is the fact that our founding fathers discovered something really quite unique. How do you order your society and your economy in such a way that you will grow the physical economy, that you will increase the productive powers of your population, that you will indeed ensure the general welfare for ourselves and our posterity, and that you can do that on a knowable scientific basis. That knowledge of the American system is almost like the third rail of politics. And when somebody touches that third rail, they get the electric shock of the British Empire coming after them. Lyndon LaRouche was one such person. But very, very interesting, just last Saturday, when Donald Trump was in Youngstown, Ohio, addressing a rally there, he got close once again to that third rail. He had an extensive section of his speech devoted to the economic policies of William McKinley. And we have a very powerful post on our website. I'll share it in the chat if people haven't seen it, talking about the importance of McKinley's policies and what Trump said about them, because McKinley was the last Lincoln Republican president we had. He was the last avowed American system president that we had, and he was also assassinated in 1901. And in a certain sense, with him, this knowledge, with his assassination, the knowledge of what we really are as Americans began to fade away. And if we don't resurrect that very, very quickly, the America First upsurge that we see throughout the country, in a sense, will be stillborn if it is not nourished once again by these ideas. And what Bob is going to be developing over the next two classes in terms of the singular role that George Washington played in the bringing to fruition of these ideas in the Constitutional Convention and in the Constitution itself is not only important from the standpoint of the urgency of rediscovering these principles, but also from the standpoint of the importance of the question of leadership, that ideas without someone with the courage to carry them forward and the genius to be able to know how to fight an enemy as evil as ours is absolutely indispensable. And that is the question of Donald Trump. For those weak-kneed people out there, you might call them the summer soldiers and the sunshine patriots, who say, oh, Trump is so radioactive. He's in so much legal trouble. He's now getting attacked day after day. Maybe we can just have Trump without Trump. You cannot, because it is a question of leadership and it's a question of courage. And the more you see these legal attacks and political attacks accelerate, and they will accelerate, because the more you know, the global elite are absolutely terrified of what is going on in the United States between the person and political leadership of Donald Trump, between the mobilization of an extraordinary citizens movement throughout this nation, which is not something you see in the press. You can see the shadow of it, when Joe Biden is standing there calling his fellow Americans semi-fascists. They're very, very afraid of something, and it isn't fascism, because that's what they are. But it is this unprecedented self-activation of a patriotic movement of citizens in this country. And when you add to that the depth of understanding of the philosophy, the economic policy, the principles that were truly the basis of the founding of our nation, you can understand the desperation of the enemy and the fact that we have to stay very serene in the coming 45 days as we go into very important midterm elections, which are going to give us a directionality in terms of how the fight will play out over the course of the next 2 years. But if we're fighting it from the standpoint on the shoulders of history, in a sense, I think people will keep their cool, keep their smarts, keep their courage, and hopefully fight in a way very commensurate with the father of our nation, George Washington. So I'm going to turn it over to Bob, and you can take it away. Let me spotlight you, Bob.
Okay, you can hear me, Susan?
Yep.
All right. Hello, everybody. Hope you're all having a good time here. As people might remember, or some people might have, maybe not, but some people know that I began this series on Washington, I don't know, month and a half ago, and presented a two-part class over 2 weeks dealing with Washington as a military commander. And I'm certainly not going to try to recapitulate any of that tonight. This is a continuation of that series. this again will be a two-part class tonight and hopefully a week from tonight, which is going to deal with Washington's leadership role in creating the republic, in creating the nation, in the adoption of the U.S. Constitution, so I hope people will get a lot out of it. I think it's very important material myself. And I just want to begin by saying that, look, we're dealing here with the American Revolution and the period immediately after, well, depending on how you define it, the period after 1783, the entirety of the American Revolution. And the unfortunate reality today is that overwhelmingly, even if people hold dear to their heart certain principles of that revolution, certain principles of the Declaration of Independence, even if we're seeing this around the country more and more, which is a good thing, the reality is that overwhelmingly the majority of Americans have a very incomplete idea of what the incomplete understanding of what the American Revolution really was. And I'll begin by saying that in my view, the revolution did not end with the Battle of Yorktown in 1781 or with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. That the American Revolution lasted 21 years. It lasted from 1775, the battles of Lexington and Concord, to 1796, to George Washington's farewell address. And this was one seamless revolution, which had as its intention the creation of a constitutional republic. That was the intention all along. You get people who sort of a populist bent or people who have a protest mentality, who think, well, the revolution was, let's get rid of the British. They're oppressing us. And, we want to get rid of the British and then we want to be left alone, this sort of bottom-up populism. That is not what went on. That is not what Washington and Franklin and others were fighting for. The revolution was not simply about separation with Great Britain. It was about fighting for higher principles of how society should be organized, of the creation of a constitutional republic, and the advancement and betterment of the human condition. George Washington was explicit about this. Later, much later, Abraham Lincoln was explicit about this. In fact, he gave a speech, which I'm not going to quote tonight, in which he says it in almost those exact words. What I said is practically a paraphrase of what Lincoln said. He said it was not about a mere separation from Britain. It was about something far more noble and, of a different nature. It was not a negative revolution. We were not just fighting against evil. We were not just fighting against oppression. It was not just resistance to the tyrant's power. It wasn't negative. It was positive. That the intention, what they were doing, what Washington, Franklin, Hamilton, and many other people were doing, is they were fighting for something. They were fighting for the creation of a republic. And that's really what the subject is of this discussion tonight. I'm going to concentrate on what happened between 1781 and 1787. And then next week, we're going to discuss the Constitutional Convention itself. What really happened at the Constitutional Convention? And it's not what Hillsdale College would teach you. So before I just plunge into this, though, I want to make a little aside. And this may seem a little bit off topic to some people or a little strange to some people, but I want to do it anyway because it's important for people to grasp the difference between fighting against something and fighting for something. And what I want to bring up is that recently there has been some discussion among some people on the topic of something called Manichaeism. Now, for those of you who are not experts in Christian theology, Manichaeism, which was condemned as a heresy in the Christian church back, 1,500 years ago, or thereabouts, Manichaeism put forward the idea that good and evil coexist, and really they're equal. I mean, if you want to get an image of it in your mind, it's kind of a banal image. You think of God on one side, Satan on the other, and they're engaged in a eternal battle, between good and evil, and that evil has an independent existence of its own, and really it is not only independent but an equal force to the good, that good and evil fight each other. Now, there was a Christian saint named Saint Augustine who wrote extensively on Manichaeism and condemned it. And he wrote extensively on it. He took it apart and looked at every facet of it. And what Augustine said is that the very idea of it was wrong. And what Augustine says is that people have to understand that evil really doesn't exist. I mean, not that evil doesn't exist in the world, but that evil has no separate existence. And that evil is only manifests itself, can only come into being and circulation and into society through a failure by us, by human beings, to fight for the good. That it is our failure to fight for the good, to fight for to fight for principles which are coherent with the creative nature of the human identity. It is our failure to fight for that which allows evil to exist and to spread. But what Augustine says is that is the nature of evil. It's a negative nature because it comes about because of our failures to act based on our nature made in the image of God. And what Augustine emphasizes is that if we act in the right kind of way, and I'm not really putting this the best that I can, but that if we act in the right kind of way, that the good is always more powerful than evil, always. And that's really the basis, in my view, for human optimism. that we know that if we act based on truthful principles, if we act for the future, if we act to develop our republic, if we act to forward scientific progress, to make a better, more human society, if we do those things, then the force that we are putting into motion is always going to be more powerful than evil. And as I said, this may seem off topic, but I would ask you to think about, what has already been mentioned about the American Revolution. They weren't just fighting against evil, you know, um, all the list of grievances in the Declaration of Independence. They weren't just fighting against evil. They were fighting to create something new. They were fighting to create a new type of society, a new type of government, a new type of republic, which the world had never seen before, which was based, among other things, on the Leibniz's notion of happiness, human progress, human advancement, and a culture which identifies the difference between human beings and animals. A culture based on the actual true nature of what it means to be human. Now you could say, well, that's highfalutin. Did all of these guys believe that? Well, in a certain sense, not even in a certain sense, really in a direct sense, the best of them did believe that. The best of them did understand that. Washington understood it. Hamilton understood it. Franklin understood it, and others, that this is what they were fighting for. And they were fighting to create not only a society, but a potential power, which ultimately would eliminate the force of empire and oligarchy worldwide. And again, I'm not reading into that. I'm not exaggerating. You can go back and read Hamilton. You can read many people, Washington, Gouverneur Morris, many of these guys, that they are very explicit, and they state it very explicitly, that the ideas that we're putting forward in the Declaration of Independence, that the principles that our nation is founded on, that these, we will work to spread these principles all over the world. We will work to create societies and to help societies, in our own image, to spread all over the world. That this was the beginning of the end of empire and oligarchical rule. And that is the question. I mean, that is how you have to perceive the mission of the United States. That is what the United States of America really is and was intended to be. And I think that gets to I'll get back into the subject of Washington here. I mean, I hope some of that made sense to you. It was the best I could do on short notice. So so as to the American Revolution, which I described as 21 years long, there were really three phases to it. There was the military phase from 1770. I mean, you could obviously go back earlier. You can go back much earlier. Boston Tea Party, all these things. Franklin's Albany Union, but we're not going to go into any of that tonight. We're going to start with Lexington and Concord. So you have the military phase from 1775, which lasted, really to 1781, because after Yorktown, there were battles, but they were small battles and they were skirmishes. And, the major fighting was over after Yorktown. Then you had the fight to create a republic. And, you could take this from 1781 up to 1788 to the ratification of the Constitution. Although it really didn't begin in 1781 because, as you'll see in some of the stuff I'm going to go through, this is very clear that this was what they were fighting for even during the military phase. All along, from 1775 onward, this is what Washington and others were fighting for, was the creation of a republic. And then from 1789 to 1796, you have the third phase, which is the establishment and the consolidation of the republic. And that's essentially the Washington presidency. And maybe at some future date, not anytime in the near future, but at some future date, we'll have, the third part on the Washington presidency. But for tonight, we're going to focus on this period leading into the adoption of the Constitution. Well, I could say some things that are a little bit repetitive. Yeah, I think it's worth doing it. I just got to keep an eye on the time. Well, Lyndon LaRouche, when he was alive, often talked about something he called the oligarchic principle or oligarchical principle. I can't remember which. But this idea that human beings are expendable, are no better than beasts, and that an elite, a hereditary or semi-hereditary, elite group of people should rule over society, and that the rest of us are slaves or serfs or useless eaters, and not to be can be killed off at any time that they deem that there's too many of us or something like that. But this is based on, when you get right down to it, this is based entirely on the idea that human beings are no better than animals. That there's no distinction between human beings and animals. We're governed by the same passions, this, that, greed, lust, what have you, and that the elite class, the oligarchical class, are sort of the apex predators, within this wild kingdom of bestiality. Again, you can't understand the American Revolution if you don't understand that idea, that oligarchical principle, is what we revolted against. It wasn't just, tax on tea or, other minor complaints or something like that. You go back to the Pilgrims, you go back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, you go back to Philadelphia, the founding of Philadelphia. The idea was, for the first time, maybe ever in European history, groups of people began to live as free people, free individuals, capable of developing, creating, making a better society, all kinds of things. And what Britain began to impose on us in the mid-18th century was top-down oligarchical rule. And we revolted against that. And this gets to the question of the republic, because a republic is not, it's not a noun, right? It's not, at least I don't consider it a noun. Grammatically, it might be. But it's not a thing. It's not a type of government. You have democracy, oligarchy, republic, it's a type of government, a noun, a thing. A republic is really an active force in the way that Washington and Hamilton demonstrated during the Washington presidency, and Lincoln demonstrated later. And we've had some other decent presidents. But a republic is an active force for the good, for the development of society, for the improvement of conditions, for scientific advancement, for freeing people from oligarchical shackles such that they can contribute, because this gets to the nature of, what is a human being? Are we beasts? Are we animals? Do we live here? Was the American Revolution or was the U.S. Constitution a social contract? Which is what a lot of some of these patriot groups think, like Madison, a social contract in which, we all recognize that really at heart, we're all greedy, lustful animals. So we're going to set up a series of rules by which we can cohabitate. We can learn to live together without killing each other, right? And these are rules that we'll all agree to abide by. It's a contract. That is not what a republic is. If you think of the preamble of the U.S. Constitution, if you think of the principles enunciated in the Declaration of Independence, a republic is always oriented towards the future. It has no reason for existence other than to orient towards the future. You're building a more productive, a better economy, a better society, for future generations. And that's what they were fighting for in the revolution. You're fighting for greater human happiness, as the term happiness is properly understood, as opposed to pleasure. I'll read you a short quote from Abraham Lincoln in 1854, one of the speeches he gave in 1854, where he said, "Our Republican robe is soiled and trailed in the dust. Let us purify it. Let us turn and wash it white in the spirit, if not the blood, of the Revolution. Let us readopt the Declaration of Independence, and with it, the practices and policy which harmonize with it. If we do this, we shall not only have saved the Union, but we shall have so saved it as to make and to keep it forever worthy of saving." And the challenge for Washington and Franklin, I'm going to talk quite a bit about Franklin next week, not this week, and Hamilton and others, was how do you create such a government? How do you create a republic such that the true nature of what it means to be human, actual human nature, can flourish, can be promoted, can be encouraged, can be supported? And that is what the fight for the Constitution was all about. It wasn't just finding a way where they could learn to live together. They had a much higher aim at what they were doing. All right, so I've already taken up too much time. So let's just go a little bit into the history of some of this. Then we'll get back to some of this at the end. We'll begin by looking at the state of the nation between 1781 and 1787, when the Constitutional Convention occurred. And then we'll go on to look at Washington's role. And And between 1781 and 1788, the individual 13 states were, for all practical purposes, independent. There was no legitimate national government, really, at all, under the Articles of Confederation. Many people at that time were either calling for a dissolution of the Union, into separate states or, smaller parts, or they were either calling for it or they expected it. There were members of the Continental Congress calling for the nation to be broken up into smaller parts. Many of the political leaders in the South were calling for the nation to be broken up into smaller parts. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was no real national sovereignty. There was no national currency. There was no national military force after 1783. The government had no power to regulate trade. The government had no power to impose taxes. During that period, states printed their own currency, which very rapidly became worthless. They set their own trade and tariff policies. New Jersey would have a tariff on something, and it would not only be a tariff on something being brought in from Europe, but it would even be a tariff on something being brought in from another state, internal tariffs. The states had their own foreign policy. After the Treaty of Paris in 1783, several states, including Virginia, demanded that the treaty be sent to them, and then their state legislature ratified the treaty, because they did not consider the treaty binding on them until their own state had ratified it. You had some states who were in separate negotiations with the Spanish about trade down the Mississippi. It was just chaos. 9 out of the 13 states. This is after 1783, after the war is over. 9 states maintained their own navies. This was not a nation. British troops still occupied forts all around the Great Lakes. The Spanish controlled the Mississippi River. As I said, Congress could impose no taxes, to raise money for anything, including to pay the soldiers, let alone build up the country. What the Congress did, the Continental Congress, is they would pass what they called requisitions, where they would requisition so much money from each state, that the state should pay into the national government. But the word requisition, these were requests, which the states were free to ignore, which they all did. And the federal government had no authority to impose their will on the states. It was left up to the states whether or not they were going to fulfill these requisitions. And in fact, George Washington commented that the requisitions, he termed them, quote, little better than a jest, unquote. There was no power to develop the nation, no power to build anything of any kind. And it was a mess. You had economic chaos. During the war, the government had printed enormous amounts, the Continental Congress had printed enormous amounts of paper currency, which by the end of the war had depreciated to the point where it was worthless. And I actually have statistics here that, they started printing this currency right away, 1775, 1776. By 1781, a continental dollar, by 1779, a continental dollar was worth 5 cents in gold. 5 cents. That was 1779. By 1781, by the time of the Battle of Yorktown, a continental dollar was worth 1/10 of 1 cent. So what you're talking about here is, without any exaggeration, Weimar Germany type hyperinflation. 1/10 of 1 cent, if you could get someone to accept it. After 1783, they stopped printing paper currency. The national government, some of the states kept doing it. But after 1783, there was no national currency, none. And what happened is that very rapidly, all forms of economic activity, all forms, from buying something from your neighbor, or buying land, or investing in a business, or shipping some cargo, all forms of economic activity and trade were carried out in British pounds, in British currency, from 1783 to 1788, 1789. By 1785, you had a deep economic depression. You had what was called the Panic of 1785. And after the war, the United States was driven backwards into a form of colonial dependence on the British Empire, which in many ways was even worse than before the war. And there's things I could go through to demonstrate that, but I won't do it for the sake of time. But between 1783 and 1789, anything we wanted to ship to England had to be shipped in British ships. The British imposed tariffs on all kinds of goods, that were being shipped out of the United States. Things they didn't want shipped in, they would refuse. They put them on a prohibited list. We were between 1783 and 1788. We were importing almost all of our manufactured goods. We were being turned into, a supplier of raw material. So, by 1786 or so, American foreign trade was completely under British control, and all economic activity being carried out in the United States was being carried out with British currency. That was the situation in 1784, 85, 86, 87. We had no economic sovereignty whatsoever. Now, you also had a situation where, getting back to this question of the Union dissolving, where, the danger of armed revolt, which the government was powerless to do anything about. After 1783, there was no standing army of any sorts. I mean, I'm not 100% positive, but if there still was an army, it was very small, because the army was disbanded after the Treaty of Paris. In 1782, you had the main force of the Washington's army, which was headquartered at Newburgh. They essentially mutinied or threatened to mutiny and to march on Philadelphia, mostly on the subject of back pay. Many of these soldiers, the overwhelming majority of the soldiers and officers, had not been paid for years. For years, they had not been paid. They threatened to mutiny and to march on Philadelphia. And it was only stopped because Washington, personally intervened, got up and gave a speech in front of the soldiers and got them to call it off. But, that's a fairly well-known incident. But in 6 months after the near mutiny at Newburgh, there was another mutiny in Pennsylvania, in Lancaster. And there was no Washington there to quell it. And the troops of the Pennsylvania line marched on Philadelphia and, surrounded the Capitol building, the State House, demanding pay. And what happened was that Congress, in the middle of the night, in the dark, they packed up their bags and they got out of town. They fled. They had no money to pay them, and they had no troops to put down the mutiny. This was the situation. And to give you an idea of how impotent this government was, from 1783 to 1788, in a period of 5 years, there were 5 different capitals. Now, this is after the British left. They weren't fleeing the British. They were in Philadelphia. And when the mutiny occurred in Philadelphia, they fled to, I believe it was to Annapolis. To Princeton. They fled to Princeton. And then from Princeton, they then relocated to Annapolis. And then they moved to Trenton. And then they moved to New York City. They didn't even have a home for the government. And they had no money. So we were literally at the point of being, completely recolonized, economically recolonized by the British in 1787. And the nation itself was at the point of dissolving. Now, there are some, modern historians, some not so modern. Some of it comes out of this sort of Marxist school of Charles Beard and his wife. And later you see it in Howard Zinn, lunatic, who, hold up the Articles of Confederation as a time of great democratic freedom, and that the Constitutional Convention was a counter-revolution by rich capitalists. This was, I don't think a lot of people outside of the woke left pay any attention to these people anymore. But, that was a line. And, the fact is, everything that had been fought for in the revolution, that people had died for, had suffered for, was all being lost between 1783 and 1787. That was the situation. So, let's get to Washington. This is supposed to be a class about Washington. The Constitution was, I shouldn't say entirely. I will say there would have been no constitutional convention or adoption of the U.S. Constitution, but for the leadership role provided by George Washington. This idea you hear, again, Hillsdale and some of these so-called patriot groups say, James Madison, the father of the Constitution. I mean, there's not a shred of truth in that, not a word of truth. And we'll get into that a lot more next week. But it was Washington who did it. Now, where this began was in 1783. And it was based on ideas that Washington had been discussing with people during the course of the war. In 1783, before the Treaty of Paris, so the war is technically still going on, and Washington is still in command of the army. In 1783, June of 1783, Washington authored, he wrote it himself, what was called a circular letter to the states. And he authored this, and he sent it out to the governors and state legislatures of all 13 states. It very quickly became public. It wasn't intended to be secret or anything, but it very quickly became public, and it was ultimately, I think very quickly, printed in almost every single newspaper in the 13 states. Almost every single newspaper. It was usually printed under the name of Washington's Legacy. That's how a lot of these, Washington didn't call it that, but that's how a lot of these newspapers titled it, Washington's Legacy. But it was his circular to the states. Now I'm going to end the class with a discussion of that, but I want to just give a couple of quotes from it right here. He says, among other things, speaking to the governors and the individual state legislatures, "This is the favorable moment to give such tone to our federal government as will enable it to answer the ends of its institution. Or this may be the ill-fated moment for relaxing the powers of the Union and annihilating the cement of the Confederation." And he goes on, "There must be a faithful and pointed compliance on the part of every state with the late proposals and demands of Congress, or the most fatal consequences will ensue." So this is his plea in 1783 for the immediate strengthening of the national government, or the most fatal consequences will ensue, which is exactly what happened. So let's just step back a second. Like I said, Washington was already working on this during the war, and he was in discussion with a lot of different people. In one letter that he wrote, and I'm not sure who he wrote this to, in 1778, so this is, I guess, about the time of the Battle of Saratoga or something. In 1778, he wrote a letter in which he says, "It does not, in my judgment, require the spirit of divination to foretell the consequences of the present administration, nor to how little purpose the states individually are framing constitutions, providing laws, and filling offices. These must all sink in the general wreck, which will carry with it the remorse of thinking that we are lost by our own folly and negligence, or by the desire of living in ease and tranquility during the accomplishment of so great a revolution. It is much to be feared that the states in their separate capacities have very inadequate ideas of the present danger." That was in 1778. In another letter, I think about a year or so later, he wrote, "The states are the primary cause of all of our disorders. Because of the states' tenacity in clinging to power, our nation is weak at home and disregarded abroad, and contemptible enough it is." And, one of the people Washington was in constant communication with was Hamilton. And to my knowledge, Hamilton was the first one to actually I could be wrong about this, so if I am, someone can correct me, but I think he was the first one to actually put forward an actual proposal for what amounts to as a constitutional convention. In 1780, so this is 7 years before the Constitutional Convention, this is 6 years before the Annapolis Convention, while the war is going on, Hamilton wrote a letter to Washington in September of 1780, in which he proposed, quote, "to call immediately a convention of all the states with full authority, of vesting Congress with complete sovereignty over all matters relating to war, peace, finance, trade, and foreign affairs." And then about a year later, Hamilton, this is also while the war is still going on, Hamilton wrote a letter to John Laurens in which he said, "We must secure our union on solid foundations, a Herculean task, and to effect which mountains of prejudice must be leveled." Excuse me. So this is the discussion that's going on. And also, it should, for those, some people might know this, but it was in 1781, again, before the Battle of Yorktown, while the outcome of the war is still not settled. In 1781, Hamilton wrote his famous letter to Robert Morris, in which he proposed the creation of a national bank. So, this is what you have going on, in 1778, 1779, 1781, 1782, throughout the war. You have this kind of dialogue, this kind of discussion going on. We must create a republic, and as Hamilton says, we might have to move mountains, but this is the goal. This is what we must do. This is the intention. So the and it's intricately tied to the economic development of the nation, which is very explicit in Hamilton's letter to Robert Morris proposing the creation of a national bank. So I'm running late, but I'll run through this. To sort of, let's quickly run through the chronology of how this occurred. The war ends in 1783. Washington leaves the army. The very next year, in 1784, he takes a tour of the Western country, going out towards Ohio and all the Western countries, Western areas. It was a trip that was 680 miles long on horseback. The primary purpose of the trip was to study the feasibility of building a canal between the Potomac River and the James River, right? Now, this is almost 40 years before the Erie Canal. And Washington, makes this journey with the idea in mind to study whether it is feasible to do this. Because if you could connect the Potomac to the James River, this then opens the way towards a potential connection into the Ohio River or into, the Ohio Territory, of opening up the West for economic development, for population growth and what have you. So that's the first thing Washington does when he gets out of the army. Then when he returned from the trip, and this was, I think, within days of him returning from the trip, he organized a conference with delegates from Virginia and Maryland, and they met in Alexandria, Virginia, including members of the state assemblies and other people. And they established the Potomac River Company, to study ways of developing the Potomac River. But Washington was not satisfied with this. In fact, he later referred to the meeting in Alexandria as bumbling business. So he organized many of these delegates to come to a second conference. He sort of reconvened the Alexandria conference at Mount Vernon at his home. And they held a second conference where their discussions and their proposals went much further. This was Washington hosting the conference, inviting the people to go there, leading the discussions, and it's all about cooperation for the economic development of the region, including uniform tariffs, including lighthouses, including canal building, and this is all taking place at Mount Vernon. Now, this was followed by Washington then persuading the Maryland and Virginia to form a new company called the I don't know how you pronounce it. It's not spelled the same. Potomac Company, which was founded in 1785. And this was founded explicitly for the idea of building a canal. And even before the Constitutional Convention, the Potomac Company is, digging ditches, hauling rocks, and starting to build a canal. Now, all of this led directly to the Annapolis Convention. The Annapolis Convention in 1786 was not organized by James Madison. It was organized by George Washington. Washington proposed to Madison, to Hamilton, and to a group of other people that following up the discussions in Mount Vernon and following up the founding of the Potomac Company, that a larger convention be called to which all the states should be invited. Washington wrote a letter to James Madison in which he said, "We are either a united people or we are not. If the former, let us in all matters of general concern act as a nation. If we are not, let us no longer act a farce by pretending to it." And, Washington got Madison to get the Virginia delegation to go. Washington got Hamilton to come down from New York. The Annapolis Convention was organized entirely at Washington's initiative. During the Annapolis Convention, Hamilton was in constant contact. Hamilton was in constant contact with Washington. And the Annapolis Convention, only 5 states sent delegates. It generally was unsuccessful, but a decision was made at that point to try again. That trying to get all the states to Annapolis had not succeeded, but they did get 5 states there. And the decision was made to try again. So Hamilton wrote out an invitation to all of the states to come to a second conference, a new conference, to be held in Philadelphia in 1787, which turned out to be the Constitutional Convention. Throughout this entire period, Washington is his correspondence is voluminous. He's writing to Hamilton, he's writing to Washington, he's writing to John Jay, he's writing to all kinds of people. He's pushing this forward. He is, in fact, the commander-in-chief of this effort, as he was during the Revolution. Through this entire period leading into Philadelphia, he's the commander-in-chief. And the other people are really his lieutenants, his junior officers. But he's coordinating him. In the summer of 1786, he had a lengthy back and forth correspondence with John Jay, on how the Articles of Confederation had to be replaced. And in one of the letters, he says, "Our affairs are drawing rapidly to a crisis. What the event will be, it is beyond the reach of my foresight. We have errors to correct. I do not conceive we can exist much longer as a nation without lodging somewhere a power which will pervade the whole Union in as energetic a manner as the authority of the state governments extend over the several states. Things cannot go on in the same train forever." So this all led into the invitation to go to Philadelphia, as people know, that results in the Constitutional Convention. But I'll repeat myself. During the war, they're explicit that this is what they're fighting for. after the British leave, it's Washington who is pulling this all together, at Mount Vernon, at Annapolis, and elsewhere, leading into Philadelphia, and defining what the issue is, what's at stake. And then, I'll just mention that, it's not just an accident, in my view. Others might disagree. And it was not just to honor his role as the commander-in-chief during the Revolutionary War that Washington was then chosen unanimously as the president of the Constitutional Convention, because everyone recognized not only his role in winning the war, but his role in bringing this convention into existence, his role in organizing for the creation of a republic. Now, I know it's late, but I mentioned the Circular of the States. This is really what kicked off the drive, for what eventually became the Constitution. It was issued June 8th, 1783. And I just want to close by reading, a few more extended excerpts from it, and then we'll open it up. As I said, it was sent to all the state governors, and it was called Washington's Legacy. It was reprinted in every newspaper, discussed throughout the country. And this is what Washington says. And these are just excerpts. It's much longer than this. The foundation of our empire was not laid in a gloomy age of ignorance and superstition, but at an epoch when the rights of mankind were better understood and more clearly defined than at any former period. Researches of the human mind after social happiness have been carried to a great extent. The treasures of knowledge acquired by the labors of philosophers, sages, and legislators through a long succession of years are laid open for us, and their collected wisdom may be happily applied in the establishment of our form of government. The free cultivation of letters, the unbounded extension of commerce, the progressive refinement of manners, the growing liberality of sentiment, and above all, the pure and benign light of revelation, have had ameliorating influence on mankind and increased the blessings of society. At this auspicious period, the United States came into existence as a nation, and if their citizens should not be completely free and happy, the fault will be entirely their own. Such is our situation. Such are our prospects. Notwithstanding the cup of blessing, the cup of blessing is thus reached out to us. Notwithstanding happiness is ours. If we have I'm massacring this. But notwithstanding the cup of blessing is thus reached out to us, notwithstanding happiness is ours if we have a disposition to seize the occasion and make it our own. Yet it appears to me there is an option still left to the United States of America. Whether they will be respectable and prosperous or contemptible and miserable as a nation. This is the time of our political probation. This is the moment when the eyes of the whole world are turned upon us. This is the time to establish or ruin our national character forever. This is the favorable moment to give such a tone to the federal government as will enable it to answer the ends of its institution, or this may be the ill-fated moment for relaxing the powers of the Union annihilating the cement of the Confederation and exposing us to become the sport of European politics, which may play one state against another and to serve their own interested purposes. For according to the system of policy the states shall adopt at this moment, they will stand or fall, and by their confirmation or lapse, it is yet to be decided whether our revolution must ultimately be considered to be as a blessing or a curse. A blessing or a curse, not to the present age alone, for with our fate will the destiny of unborn millions be involved. With this conviction of the importance of the present crisis, silence in me would be a crime. I will therefore speak the language of freedom and sincerity without disguise. That's George Washington. That is where the Constitution of the United States comes from. So I'm going to end right there.